Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yakker. My guest on today's show is accomplished graphic designer, artist, author, and podcaster Stan Mace. I'll be talking with him about his book, Para-Normality, Normalising the Paranormal. Stan Mace, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Thank you for having me here, and it's nice to meet another fellow Stan. There's more of us out there than I knew before, so equally as excited to talk to you about my very, very strange life.
Yes, which I look forward to learning about and sharing with my viewers. Your introduction to the world of the paranormal started when, as a young boy, you had an out of body experience and met face to face with a dark entity. Could you, Stan, tell me about that event, if you shared it with any family members or friends? And perhaps most importantly, how did it affect you, if it did at all, as you were growing up?
Oh yeah, gosh, it wasn't my best day, if you forgive my dry humor. It's a memory I've had to come to terms with as an adult, and it's taken me many years to fully comprehend what happened and deal with the effects of that. So yeah, it's a long time ago, back in the 90s, and that shows how old I am. I was hit by a car on the way to visit my grandmother's house when I was living in Oxford. And yeah, as you can imagine, I was in quite a bad way, a really, really bad way. And it's a pain that I'll never forget. Like a little kid to experience that amount of pain, like that stays with you for life. And no kid should ever have to go through that, really, which is why I hold my kids close today and be grateful they don't, of course, have to experience that. But anyway, I was rushed to the hospital and I went through a number of emergency operations. And I'm not sure which operation, but at some point I realized that previously my legs were broken. They're completely cannot be used in a terrible state. Yet I found myself standing in the hospital. It's a really weird feeling to be without your body. At the time, I didn't know I didn't have a body at the time. I thought I was just awake in reality. I started to explore hospital corridors trying to look for my doctor or my mum who was with me at the time. And I could see people in beds, like children in their own beds. Of course, this was a pediatric ward, so there was a child in one room, child in another, and I recognized their faces. They looked very real. And I tried to signal to them to get their attention, and they couldn't see me. It's like I was invisible to them. I would wave, I'd try and pulling on their bed covers, tried, touching or moving the door, and yeah, nothing. Doctors would walk by me, a nurse walked by me, just didn't see me. And I remember something at that point beginning to be a bit was stranger than it already was. The fact that my vision was hyper focused. It's like I could see like every molecule in the wall around me. I could see everything. Everything was ultra sharp. And yeah, at that point, I was getting a bit more spooked. So I walked down the corridor and I think I walked left and then right past the different rooms. And eventually I encountered this room. It's very strange because it had like a glass window and the door was open. And to the left of me, there were some various doctors' garments. There were various different, I don't know, medical equipment left around in boxes. And to the right of me, I saw a whole wall full of holes. And it's like the wall itself had openings. And the openings were made out of metal. And there were strange beds in there. And at the time, I didn't know what that was. I later found out that was the morgue I was in. As I entered this room, there was something in there. And there was something in there that was quite frightening. That was quite large that I couldn't quite comprehend. It's almost like it was there, but it wasn't there. And it felt like there was something there kind of folding in on itself. And at this point, I came into contact with this being. I don't know. I don't know. I kind of wonder if I was maybe absorbed into it, though, whether I tried to escape and it pulled me in. I don't know whether it was a choice of mine or it or whatever it was, but it just felt so immensely powerful. Like when I was absorbed by this thing, it's like an overloaded socket, really. Like everything sped up and got faster and faster. And if you imagine, like, again, showing my age, like a VHS tape being sped up faster and faster, you could see more and more and more frames. As this happened, I was shown different places. I was shown different cities, times, planets, all sorts of different things. And at one point, I remember I was flying over this city and I was approaching this lake. And I went slower to land. And I noticed there was a platform below me and there was a train yard there. I could see trains and tracks and various objects there. And this walkway went over the train yard, down, and then over this big, beautiful lake. And I could see a city beyond. As I landed there, there were people stood in this walkway, and it was that time, for the first time in this experience, that they responded to me being there. It's like as I landed, they jumped. So I'm not sure whether I materialized, whether the whole thing was a dream. I mean, who knows really? But yeah, as I landed there, again, everything was hyper detailed. I could see the molecules of everything. I was part of everything basically. As I landed, I observed this place. I was part of this place, and it was entirely new to me then. At that point, I was then thrust back towards, I don't know, this being past me from planet to planet, from universe to universe. It was just like too much. It was like an overload again, like I say. At one point, I felt like I was just going to burn up. Basically, there was too much data being passed through me, and too much of this experience. And I remember screaming for my mum, basically, like in this in-between world, whatever it might be, almost trying to escape the man at the edge of time, really. And I then found myself awake in my body a few days later. At the time, I assumed it was a dream. Of course, with me being quite young, psychologically, all you're trying to do is just grasp any information to try and stabilize and calm yourself, because my body was completely wrapped, had various bandages over my legs. I had metal going through my bones to pull my legs together so they could heal. So I physically couldn't have walked. Yet I had a memory of walking the entire hospital. The weeks went by, and eventually this nurse came to me and said, "Look, okay, you're doing a bit better now. Would you like to have a change of scenery?" I jumped at the chance. I mean, well, I couldn't jump because my legs weren't working at the time, but I said, "Yeah, no problem. I'd love that." And she put me in a wheelchair and started to move me around the hospital. And that's when I recognized that this was the place for my dream. In my body, there and then, I was visiting this place for the first time. I wouldn't have known which corridor leads to which room. And as I went past the room, I recognized each of the kids in the room. I recognized the nurses at their station. I told her to go left and to go right. And eventually I found my way towards that room that I met this entity. That room existed. So I noticed that there and then that yes, it was a morgue. I wasn't able to enter the room because there was a security door in front of it, but I could see a large glass window. You could see straight through to it, where you had the morgue doors to the right, the various storage items and medical equipment to the left, and it was exactly as I saw it. That was my first experience of what psychologists call ontological shock. It's that realization that your previously understood, or I mean, at least the reality taught to me, is broken. It no longer makes sense, and it's frightening to no longer have a base of understanding of why you're here, why you're alive. And that was frightening. So that poor nurse, like, just thought, okay, I'll take this kid for a nice roll around the hospital, though. Why on earth is he screaming? Bless her. So yeah, as time went by, I got better and better, and I noticed that coming back from this experience, I did have a positive. I had this urge to draw, and so seemingly kind of overnight, I went from being a non-creative kid to being a highly creative kid, and I obsessively drew my way out of the hospital. So I asked for any pens, papers, paints I could find, and that got me through. That allowed me to survive and heal. I mean, like that was like the worst pain I've been through the following weeks, as well as my body had to be patched together and various different things. And I do joke a bit though. I'm a bit like Frankenstein's monster in some way or form, though, and I'm very grateful to be alive still and be able to walk. And like the end of this first part of the story is about 3 years later. I was, of course, able to walk then, doing a lot better with a few issues. I was out with my friend on the outskirts of Oxford. And anyone knows Oxford well enough, of course, the centre of the city is very busy, full of cars. So my friend said, "Hey, actually, look, we want to go swimming today at Hinksey Pool. I know a secret way in that you haven't been to before." I thought, okay, great. So we stopped on the outside of the city, and we walked along this path, which the locals call the Devil's Backbone. And despite the name, it's actually quite a beautiful location. But I followed him on this path because I didn't know where we were going anyway. And eventually I found my way towards this place, which was the train yard that I saw in this so-called dream, which I now know is an out-of-body experience. As I walked over the train yard and down the steps, there was the lake, the place that I flew originally. And again, that was my second experience of shock, where my poor friend, thinking I was having a great time, turned around and my body shut down. I couldn't move. I went into, I don't know whether it was a seizure or something like that, though, but my body just like gave up for just a moment. I couldn't comprehend this overlap in understanding of reality in my experience. So yeah, and how it affected me for many years later, simply put, is yeah, I came back with an artistic ability and also the abilities closely linked to a mediumship, but also with that, that entity that I met out there in a beyond followed me back and basically harassed my family for years. So yeah, so I know that's quite a big introduction, Stan, and I hope that's okay and doesn't scare your viewers too much. But it was a horrifying experience, but thankfully, because of that experience, I can do what I do today, and I have a great career from this ability that I have. But also through what I do through the book Para-Normality as well, I'm trying to normalize having the conversation about the paranormal, that people should be scared to talk about these things because it's a great opportunity to learn from each other and learn what on earth
In Paranormality, you take your readers on an amazing journey in which you relate true, multiple, firsthand accounts of unexplained paranormal events, in addition to your own out of body experience, which you've just told me about. You write about others who had out of body experiences. Can you, Stan, tell me about any of them, please?
In the book, I write about my out-of-body experience, but I do know others that have had similar experiences as well. I previously thought that consciousness sat in the body. Essentially, everything was in the brain or the heart or whatever it may be. But from having the experience I've had, I've later come to realize that, of course, consciousness seems to be maybe a transmission, and maybe we're the receiver. We're a vessel of sorts to house that consciousness, as we seem to be able to operate without the need of a body. What I do through my podcast, Paranormal Perspectives, I spoke to other people who've had exactly that same experience. It's more common than you think.
People who have had meetings with powerful entities are covered in your book. Could you tell me about the dynamics of one or two of them, such as the circumstances in which they occurred? Did the entities communicate with the humans verbally or telepathically? And what did the entities say to those they contacted?
The book is all completely my first-hand experiences. As I have to say, from my first-hand experience, I've met some pretty wild entities, to say the least. I'll give you one example. Of course, I've told you about the being that I met in the Beyond, my first out-of-body experience. A few years later, I was going through a quite rough patch. I was having some issues with my job and the way they were treating me, and as well as that, it was the pandemic as well. As a parent of young children, my stress levels were through the roof, really, and I was at a point of just kind of giving up, really. Like my body was just shutting down because I was so overworked and exhausted. It's kind of thing that many people really went through at the time, with everything kind of essentially falling apart because I was lost my job at the time as well, and I wasn't sure how I'll be able to provide for my family. Basically, so that doubt comes in, and you begin to question where you're meant to go next. With that, I went to bed one night, and I do feel like this comes from my initial experience at the start. In this dream, I had the most visceral experience where I met an entity. And what I saw was outside environment. It looked like a forest, really. Just on the outside of this forest, I could see the sun was just beginning to rise, and there was this large metal column going up through the center. And at the top of this column, there was two beings. One being on the left was this very old, almost like looks like a king, really, like a disheveled man with a beard, tattered beard, and wearing tattered robes, very ornate, beautiful robes, very old and tired, sat on a throne that was cracking, falling to pieces. And weirdly, when I looked at this thing, I felt like it was me. It was part of me and maybe a representation of how I felt at the time. Part of that you could describe as just being your standard dream. But the weird thing is, to the right of this being, this man, whoever it may be, was this large, tall, blue being, and it looked like a man, but was very tall and slender. I'd say it's over 6 or 7 foot tall, really, like taller than the average person. It had a bow and arrow on its back and blue skin, and had a very tightly woven knot at the back of its head. Its head was like mostly bald with a bit of hair. It was very unusual looking. But when I looked at this being, I felt like I couldn't move. And as it turned to me, it sang this song. And something along the lines of the wording Yahweh Navu happy or something like that, basically. I felt like it was almost like a translated message as it spoke to me, but it sang so loud that it almost threw me off of this column as it was so high up, and I almost fell backwards over it. And the force was so powerful, I felt like it propelled me through the air. And I then woke up just a moment later, like I just shot out of bed. And the strangest thing is, as I woke up, I could still hear the song in reality as I woke up, like at the end of that word, which kind of translated to happy, basically. And my heart was racing, but weirdly, I went from being the night before, like hopeless, fed up, just feel like giving up, really, to waking up the next morning feeling energized. For some reason, I just knew in my head everything's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. And I don't know why, but I feel like everything is going to be great. Just about 2 days later, I was offered my dream job out of nowhere. Like, I don't know what happened. I thought, great, I feel like I've saved my family, really. Like, this amazing opportunity's come about. I don't know where the energy came from, like something happened. So with me saying that, yeah, there are entities out there that maybe willingly or unwillingly call upon sometimes, that maybe give us that little nudge forward. They're never going to do all these things for you. And I would love to understand what they are, where they come from, how it even works, really. And a friend of mine who I've discussed, who's a medium, they have a bit of a better understanding of how these things work. They theorized that the description that I gave and the way it interacted with me, it could be related to, I think they said the Archangel Metatron, which I don't know much about just yet, but that's something I'm going to look into maybe in my next book anyway, because I didn't believe in this kind of stuff before, but I had a direct interaction with something, which it might be Metatron, it might be something else though, but either way, there seems to be something else out there.
You, Stan, once participated in a paranormal investigation that took place at the medieval Oxford Castle, which over the years has been a royal fortress, a center for justice, and a notorious jail. You were the witness to some unexplainable activity. Could you elaborate on your experience at the Oxford Castle and Prison?
That is a fascinating night because that night I had never been part of an investigation before. I didn't know what to expect. I used to watch, I don't know if you guys know about it in the US though, but there's a show in the UK called Most Haunted. Everybody kind of religiously watches it every week. Well, at least used to for many years, where you watch these live investigations. A lot of it will be kind of acting or exaggeration though, but I was kind of into it then from the point of an entertainment perspective, an observational, maybe neutral minded perspective, I suppose. So either way, I went there not really expecting much to happen. The Oxford Castle itself, for anyone that hasn't been, as you described it, is medieval. It has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history there, and a lot of people have died there. A lot of people were imprisoned there, like some of our most notorious criminals of the past. One specifically was the Black Panther. The original Black Panther was a notorious criminal, yeah, from Oxford back in the day, and he has a cell built specifically for him. It's beyond having a padded cell. It's like layer upon layer upon layer because he was well known for escaping. So as you can imagine, obviously energies there are going to be quite dark and quite challenging. I was part of a small group of people and we were invited into the crypt to start off with. This was about 11 o'clock at night, I think it was. So it was after dark. So yeah, the crypt itself, it's not a very large room. There are lots of pillars there. The ceiling is quite low. All I knew about the place is it's where they processed prisoners when they passed away. So the bodies were kept down there to be processed and registered and everything. The strange thing is, the energy in there felt a bit odd, like gravity was a bit heavier than normal. I did notice that when I went into that room, so I thought that was a bit strange, but maybe it's just me reacting to the way other people are reacting to the environment. So that's a possible thing. So actually, hey, look, I think our first experiment, we're going to do table tipping. And at the time, I didn't really believe in table tipping. I thought it seemed a bit silly or too easy to fake. So there was a bit of a bias there. What I did was say to them, okay, well, we're doing table tipping. Do you mind if I carry the table over and can just check to see if there's anything on the table that might influence any activity? So I did that, and just a standard small table. It's like a little table, it's like a fold away one. Placed it on the floor, and it was quite a dark room at the time. There was a light to the left of me, and there's a light placed in just the right place where you could actually see the shadow of the table leg touch the floor. So you knew it was making contact with the ground anyway. So that's a good thing to make sure of before we did this test. So I didn't really expect anything of what they, but yeah, just experienced it. You never know what could happen. There was three other people with me, so we stood on each side of the table. I decided when we were to put our hands on the table that we were to put them upside down. So it's harder for you to put pressure. Obviously not impossible to move a table, but harder. And with our legs stood away from the table, so I thought, okay, that's reducing the variables there. One of us began talking, just asking, yeah, who's there? Tell us your name, just general kind of conversational things. Admittedly, I was a bit shy at the time. I didn't really say too much. I kind of left the talking to other people. Yeah, I wasn't really sure, what do you say to a ghost? Like, do you ask it, is it what's your favorite color kind of thing? Like, what do you say to a ghost, really? But no, they're really good at asking the right questions, just getting some sort of a reaction because I noticed the table began to rock left and right. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that could be one of us, maybe unaware, affecting the table, pushing it subconsciously in some way or form because there is a possibility of that. And then it kept moving more and more. And so I thought, okay, let's each of us take our hands off the table one at a time to see if it could be one of us. And it kept moving backwards and forwards. And even at the point where, when one person let go of the table, where you would expect them to be pushing, it still continued as if there was something there, which I thought, okay, this is really getting a bit weird now. And at that point, we're beginning to see our breath. And it was previously, I should have mentioned as well, it was a bit cold in there, as you would expect at half 11, nearly 12 o'clock at that point at night. But the temperatures dropped to a point where we suddenly started to see our breath, which was really strange. It got more and more rapid and faster, and eventually it came to a point where I'm not sure what happened there, but I just saw the whole thing happen there. Like now it just seemed like a dream, really. But it lifted off the floor for just a moment and twisted. And I knew that because I could see the shadow from the table separate from the table leg, and then it dropped with a clack just a moment later. And as we both let go, it's like my hands were stinging like they've been shocked with electricity, and a couple of us like felt the same as well, like stinging hands. One of us, the hands felt really hot. I think the other person like didn't feel any kind of physical effects, but we all woke up, quite freaked out really. So that was years after I had my own, first-hand paranormal experiences with my whole out-of-body experience. Then, as an adult, I was beginning to see that you can experience these things with other people. I would like to think there's a currently available scientific explanation for that, but at the moment, it just seems like it's something outside our realm of current understanding because it's one of those things like you needed to be there to understand what it felt like. So that was a fascinating experience. I've been back to Oxford Castle a couple of times since, and we've had less activity going there. But admittedly, the groups were much bigger going back as well. So sometimes you can get kind of almost psychic pollution. So that's one story that's in the book. I just keep finding myself in these very unusual situations since I had this experience.
What, Stan, can you tell me about reality shifting visions?
It's quite a horrible experience to explain. Bear with me, but our house, we had objects moving in the house. We had unexplained whistling and music and smoke and just various unusual things. But at one point, things escalated where I think following some very intense experiences in the house, I returned back to my room. As I approached my bedroom door, I felt like there was something pushing me into the ground, like gravity had changed for a moment. And I could feel like when you instinctually feel like something bad is coming, it's like, but you feel like you have to do it anyway. It's just part of maybe that story. So I had to push open the door. At that point, I thought, okay, well, I don't want anything to control my life. I'm not going to be harassed by this horrible thing anymore. And I opened the bedroom door. It was horrifying. It was mid-afternoon, so of course daytime. But I remember as I opened the bedroom door, the curtains were open and you could see the windows. It was night, so the room itself was dark, which was just, of course, immediately very strange. But I noticed that the room itself was warping. It's like I could smell like it was quite a bad smell in there as well. Like I don't know what. It just smelled like burnt barbecue. That's the best way I can describe it, really. Like a really, yeah, really bad barbecue. And I remember reality itself, like I say, just twisting, contorting to a certain point in the room. And I could just feel, just like I had in my out-of-body experience, that something in there was vast. It was like I was encountering a planet, basically. Yet you couldn't physically see anything in terms of a person or an entity or something, but all you could see was the effects of something being there, if that makes sense. But yeah, I did what any other normal person would do, is just drop everything on the floor and run. I ran down the stairs so fast, straight out the house and down the street. I know saying that, and it was horrifying. And that was the pinnacle at my time in my childhood home where we couldn't deal with it anymore. It was no longer safe. It didn't feel right. Thankfully, a local medium, a friend of mine, or a now friend, that back then we didn't know who they were, came into contact with us saying, look, okay, there's something around this place, and if you don't mind, I'd love to help you. And she did. She really scared that thing off. And yeah, that's another big part of the story. So again, some things happen and it's out of your control and it's not your fault. And that's the thing. I used to think for many years, like, maybe it's my fault that this thing followed me back from the hospital and maybe I did something wrong to deserve it, but no, I didn't. And I'm just really thankful that this thing's gone now, wherever it is and whatever it's doing now. Just glad it's not around.
You, Stan, have said it's your hope that readers of your book will be inspired by it and that it will motivate them to learn more about their own life and existence, and that it's important that the conversation about the paranormal be normalized. What are your reasons for saying that?
Definitely. Well, just like you, Stan, and your channel, you're normalizing the paranormal, aren't you, by talking about it? So you talk to people from various different backgrounds who've had different experiences, and you're offering people an opportunity to learn. And what you're doing at that is so great on your channel is you're affording people an education. I very much believe education shouldn't be only available to people with the most coin. I do believe that education should be available to everybody, and the paranormal side of life is a form of education that not money can buy, nor is available to everybody, really. What we're kind of doing is bringing that conversation back down to reality, where we're moving away from the woo. I love the American term woo. I'm calling it woo. Moving away from that way of seeing things, and ultimately seeing the paranormal as a barrier. Really, that's like the no-go zone. You don't talk about that kind of thing. We only think within the defined reality that's been defined for us by others. And by normalizing the conversation, you're breaking down that barrier, exploring the acres beyond the yard, so to speak, and learning about the universe and realizing actually it's not that scary. I know with me saying that, I've just told you a scary story, so I realized realized the contrast there. But by normalizing the paranormal, you're taking the power back. You're no longer being scared about what you don't understand. And the book itself is like, an invite, really. I think it's the best way to describe it, really. I'm just a normal dude. I'm just a normal kid. I'm really nothing special. I wasn't then anyway. And I was thrust into a situation that I didn't ask for. And it was really hard to deal with, really lonely being an experiencer because you can't tell people about these kind of things because ridicule is a thing. So again, normalizing the paranormal, I'm teaching people to stop ridiculing and start learning. And that's the thing. I do believe we will have a more peaceful, evolved world as time goes by, as we begin to understand these paranormal events are normal. That's why in my book, the cover itself is the word para and normal. There's a break in the word, and it's deliberate because we're breaking the paranormal apart ultimately. We're making it normal. And that's the idea. I just hope that whoever reads it, there might be some people out there who are really scared that they've seen some awful things and they don't know who to turn to. That book, I'm hoping it might give them a nudge for them to maybe tell their story or maybe to go and seek help from somebody. You shouldn't be embarrassed to talk about the things that you don't understand. There's lots of things that I don't understand about the world. Like I barely have touched upon 0.1% of what I could know of the universe. I fully admit that, and there's no shame in saying like I don't know what that is. Stop calling it paranormal or magic. Just say I don't know what happened. Let's investigate. Let's learn more from each other.
You're the host of the UK-based podcast, Paranormal Perspectives. Can you, Stan, tell me about it?
It's what's just like your show, really. Despite me kind of doing what you do, I find it very hard to say the title of my own show because I don't know if you notice, I have a slight speech impediment as well. So calling it Paranormal Perspectives, it's really, it's so hard. So it's my fault for calling it that. So yeah, ultimately, again, normalizing the paranormal. The show is all about just talking to people from all different walks of life. It doesn't matter what your background is, who you are. If you've got a story to share, please do. Like you're here to share your story without judgment. And again, it's affording knowledge to people and giving them an opportunity to learn and make their own decisions. So really, it kind of acts like an archive. It's like, yeah, there are stories in there that are really entertaining, very scary stories, and some really, really just fun, happy, kind of, joyful stories, really. But it's like an archive, really. It's like a library of like knowledge that I hope to build over time that people maybe in 10, 20, 100 years' time could go back and look at this library of human experiences and make a decision of, okay, this is where humanity was then. This is what they were trying to learn now. This is maybe a great representation of where we were headed. I do believe a lot of the paranormal is future normal, really. It's future science in some way or form, because, a long time ago, humanity used to think that the creation of fire was only to be made by the gods. And now we have everything. We can create our own light, our own energy, various different things a long time ago that used to be magic. So isn't the paranormal just modern magic, the modern description of magic?
Should viewers of Paranormal Yakker want to buy Para-Normality, Normalizing the Paranormal, how, Stan, can they do that?
It's available in, of course, printed, the classic physical printed editions, and ebook available. So you can get it on Amazon. You can get it via the Collective Ink website. I have a little mini site as well where you can access all different versions of the book, but pretty much any store you want to go to, it will be available there.
Stan Mace, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakker. It's been great yapping with you.
Pleasure. No, thank you so much, and it's lovely to meet you.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallard of Paranormal Yakker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.